The following is a retelling of the events that occurred during the German invasion of Denmark and Norway on April 9th, 1940. In the far north of Sweden there lies a mining town by the name of Kiruna. It's Sweden's northernmost town. Situated almost 150 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, conditions are what you would expect. Relatively mild in the summer, with winter temperatures dropping as far as 40 below in the worst of cases. Why would anyone live in Kiruna? Because work is available. Mining work. There is plenty of high-quality iron to be dug from the ground in northern Sweden. Once mined, the iron is shipped by rail to either Luleå in the east or the Norwegian port of Narvik in the west. Luleå is a Swedish port town in the Gulf of Bothnia. In the winter months, however, the Gulf is prone to freezing, halting shipments out of Luleå, and making the Norwegian port of Narvik the only viable transport route for the precious iron ore. Back at the start of World War II, when the Allied forces enforced a blockade of goods to Germany, the head of the Kriegsmarine, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, informed Hitler that war would be impossible unless the Navy receives the supply of iron ore it needed, ore from Sweden. This was the first point of strategic importance that led to Hitler's decision to invade Norway. The second was a coastline issue. As I mentioned in my previous video, Germany's coastal line is relatively small. If you've ever seen Norway on a map, you would know if there's one thing we have, it is beachfront property. There's a reason the Norwegian equivalent of the phrase "around these parts" is literally "in this fjord." By holding Norway and Denmark, Germany would be able to become a serious player in the naval engagements of the Atlantic. The third reason was preventing the British and French forces from doing exactly the same thing and then choking Germany completely for resources before war could get properly underway. Remember, the push into France didn't happen until May of 1940. In fact, the British did have an operational plan to mine Norwegian waters and provoke a German response, named Operation Wilfred. It was prepared as a precursor for Plan R4 to occupy Narvik and other strategically important locations. The same Plan R4 Quisling told Hitler about on December 14th the previous year. Operation Wilfred was to commence on April 5th, 1940. However, the British and the French got into it about some of the details, and the operation was postponed until April 8th. Operation Weserübung, however, was kicking off from April 9th. Ironically, the reaction the British were hoping to provoke was already well underway, and coming faster and harder than anyone had anticipated, least of all the Norwegians. On April 4th, the Danes were warned of the upcoming invasion by Admiral Canaris, chief of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence. Canaris was involved with the German resistance movement, something which, at the time, was punishable by death. The Nazis didn't take kindly to high treason.
Looks like the EMP isn't here, but there might be some other valuable loot for us. You can either check it now or come back later.
At 4:15 in the morning, April 9th, 1940, the Wehrmacht entered Denmark. The Kriegsmarine landed troops on the shore, and the Luftwaffe strafed the scattered Danish resistance. The fighting was sporadic and sparse and lasted for approximately 2 hours. The Danish Prime Minister ordered the Danish forces to stand down to avoid any chance of the Germans bombing Copenhagen. While it could be argued that the blitzkrieg tactics used in Poland were effective yet again, the Danish troops had standing orders to not deploy or prepare defensive positions. This was done to avoid German provocation. The Danes knew the Germans were the bigger dogs in this particular fight, and they attempted to save as many of their own lives as they could. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the first ever paratrooper attack in history occurred when Fallschirmjägers jumped from a fleet of Junkers to secure the Storström Bridge. The landing would open a way for a battalion of German soldiers to march on Copenhagen. The entirety of the Danish air service was stationed at Valløse near Copenhagen. Plans were underway to disperse the aircraft to various airfields and bases around Denmark, but as fate would have it, at 5:25 in the morning, the Luftwaffe bombed the entire Danish Air Force's aerial capabilities out of existence.
Look out, guard.
At approximately 7 a.m., a platoon of Fallschirmjägers landed in Aalborg to capture the primary target of the occupation of Denmark, the largest airfield closest to Norway. Less than an hour later, German aircraft were arriving there in force. At 08:34 in the morning, the Danish government officially capitulated. The German invasion forces had 6 primary targets in Norway: Oslo, the capital city, Kristiansand, Egersund, Bergen, Trondheim, and of course, Narvik. With the exception of paratroopers capturing 2 airfields, Fornebu outside Oslo and Sola outside Stavanger, all the German forces would arrive by ship. No less than 10 destroyers carrying around 2,000 infantry was sent to Narvik. The heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and 4 destroyers were sent to Trondheim. They were called Kampfgruppe 1 and 2 respectively. These forces were also escorted by the larger battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. 2 light cruisers and some smaller support vessels were directed to Bergen. This would be Kampfgruppe 3. Kampfgruppe 4 consisted of 1 light cruiser and several support vessels who were to take Kristiansand. Kampfgruppe 6 were 4 minesweepers who were sent to Egersund, carrying troops whose mission was to cut the undersea telegraph cable connecting Norway and the United Kingdom.
Hey, I got your escape driver coming in by boat. Head over to the small border access area near the river.
To Oslo, they sent Kampfgruppe 5, the heavy cruisers Blücher and Lützow, the light cruiser Emden, 3 torpedo boats, and 8 minesweepers. The ships also carried around 2,000 infantrymen.
Watch out, there's a guard.
On the 8th of April, the British submarine Triton sighted the convoy of Battle Group 5 in the Skagerrak Strait and fired torpedoes at them. The torpedoes were successfully avoided, and the ships continued on their path into the Oslo fjord. Shortly before midnight, the Norwegian patrol boat Pol 3 out of Tønsberg spotted the German convoy. Aboard the Blücher, Admiral Oskar Kummetz radioed the torpedo boat Albatross to intercept. Pol 3 fired a warning shot and closed the distance to the German torpedo boat. Laughably outnumbered, Pol 3 radioed a warning about the invasion force to the Horten naval base at Karl Johansvern, which was, at the time, the main base of operations for the Royal Norwegian Navy. The captain of the Pole Free, Leif Welding Olsen, then gave orders to ram the Albatross. The captain of the Albatross, Kapitan Lieutenant Siegfried Strello, ordered his ship's anti-aircraft guns to fire on the oncoming vessel, as well as to open fire with machine guns. The Pole Free hit the Albatross, but was now on fire and had to be abandoned. Captain Welding Olsen was struck in the leg by machine gun fire and was suffering heavy blood loss. The lifeboat was lowered, but it capsized, and the crew had to cling to it in the cold water. Weakened by the blood loss, Captain Welding Olsen lost his grip and drowned, and as such, became the first Norwegian casualty in the war between Norway and Nazi Germany. The Norwegians now found themselves in a shooting war. The warning didn't go unheeded though. At Rauai Fort, the German convoy was spotted by a searchlight, and the fort fired 2 warning shots. A few minutes later, the fort at Bolerne fired another warning shot. Rauai then targeted Blücher and fired 4 rounds, but due to fog and low visibility, none of the shots landed. The ships moved out of range and closed on the capital city. Rauai and Bolerne both forwarded their situation, along with Pole Free's warning up the coast to Oscarsborg Fortress. Shortly after midnight, the NRK, the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, sent out a blanket warning to all lighthouses up and down the coast to go dark. In Oslo, the cabinet and members of the government, as well as the king and the royal family, were all waiting for news. As a preemptive measure, the order went out to the Norwegian Bank to load the entirety of the Norwegian National Treasury onto trucks and shift it north to Lillehammer for further transport. The treasury contained some 53 metric tons of gold, consisting of 818 crates of 40 kilos each, 685 crates of 25 kilos each, as well as 39 barrels of gold coins weighing a hefty 80 kilos each. About an hour after that, the German convoy stopped to set ashore a landing party of 150 infantrymen to engage the Norwegians at Rauai, Bolerne and Karl Johansvern and captured the city of Horten. Then, the ships continued on Oslo. At Oscarsborg Fortress, located on the island of Kaholmen outside the town of Drøbak, an aging base commander, Colonel Birger Eriksen, 6 months from retirement, had been receiving reports from down south in the fjord and was putting the base on high alert. The trouble was, there were not enough crew to man the 3 defensive turrets. In fact, with the exception of officers and non-coms, almost all of the present soldiers were completely fresh recruits, arriving literally 7 days earlier, on April 2nd. Besides the defensive turrets at Oscarsborg, there was also a torpedo battery situated at the northern end of Kaholmen Island. The torpedo battery system was 40 years old at this time, however, meaning it was built sometime around the turn of the century. The commander of the torpedo battery at Kaholmen had gone on sick leave back in March, so Colonel Eriksen reached out to former torpedo battery commander Andreas Andersen. Commander Andersen had been retired since 1927, but he knew the 40-year-old systems well. At 4:20 in the morning, in Oslo, German diplomat Kurt Brauer delivered Germany's demands for complete surrender to the Norwegian government. The Norwegian government refused all demands.
Watch out, there's a guard.
1 minute later, at 04:21, the Blücher came into view south of the fort at Oscarsborg. Colonel Eriksen had pulled every able-bodied man available to crew 2 of the 3 main turret guns, including staff from the mess hall. Similarly, Torpedo Commander Andersen had to make do with recruits from the Norwegian Officer Candidate School, also 7 days fresh, to crew and prepare the torpedo launch tubes. Commander Andersen demanded to be categorically ordered to fire on any ship, which Colonel Eriksen gave him, absolving Andersen of any blame for the chain of command in case the ships turn out to be of friendly intent. Colonel Eriksen knew different. Ships of war were coming up the Oslo fjord with their lights darkened at an ungodly hour with radio warnings from Forts Point south already mentioning encounters. There was no friendly intent here. When asked if they should fire warning shots, Colonel Eriksen said no. They've already had their warning shots further south in the fjord. When asked about the possibility of being wrong, Eriksson uttered the now famous phrase, "Either I will be tried in a court-martial, or I will be a war hero. Fire." At 04:21, the massive 11-inch guns at Oscarsborg opened fire on the Blücher, firing massive 562-pound artillery shells. The first round struck the battle station for the commander of the anti-aircraft guns, setting fire to the ship and knocking out the main rangefinder. The second struck near the aircraft hangar and started fires, which spread to the storage for infantry explosives. When the storage went up, it took both onboard recon airplanes with it, as well as destroying a turbine room. On the mainland side, near Drøbak, the Koppås battery opened fire with their 5.9-inch guns, riddling the Blücher's starboard side, before switching targets to the Lützow. The Blücher increased its speed to 32 knots to attempt to pass the Norwegian guns, but the damage from the Koppås batteries had disabled steering from the bridge and she was turning to port. Captain Heinrich Oltag ordered the machine crews to get her back on track by using the side shafts, but this cost them significant speed. At this point, Commander Anderson was given the order to fire, and at 04:25, 2 torpedoes struck the Blücher, the first hitting a boiler room and the second taking out the remaining turbines. The remaining German ships, not believing the fjord to be mined, retreated south. When the batteries at Koppås radioed Oscarsborg whether or not they should continue firing at the Blücher, Colonel Eriksson ordered them to stand down, concluding that the Norwegian defenses had served their purpose. The fire aboard the Blücher spread, however, and eventually reached the storage for their 10.5 cm ammunition magazines for the ship's flak guns. The resulting explosion was immense, and the blast ruptured several bulkheads in the engine room and ignited the ship's fuel stores. At 07:30 in the morning, the Blücher rolled over and sank with significant casualties, as several of the infantrymen came from inland Germany and couldn't swim. Reports on loss of life varies, but it is estimated anywhere between 300 and 1,300 soldiers and sailors lost their lives. The remaining German battle group set ashore on the eastern side of the fjord to the south, near Son, and marched north from the capital. The actions taken at Oscarsborg would delay the German invasion of Oslo by some 24 hours. This bought the Norwegians important time. Early in the morning, the royal family and members of the government boarded the train inland for Hamar, evading capture.
That's the key code we needed. Get back to the train and open the door. Looks like the EMP isn't in this train car. There could still be some valuable loot here. So either grab it now or come back for it later. Your choice.
At Narvik, ships appeared in the Ofot fjord among fog and heavy snow. They were met by the 40-year-old light cruiser HNO-MS Eidsvoll. The German destroyer Wilhelm Heidkamp launched a skiff to ferry corvetten Kapitan Gerlach over to the Eidsvoll to discuss terms with Captain Odd Isaksen Willoch. Captain Willoch was the uncle of future Norwegian Prime Minister Kåre Willoch. Gerlach attempted to convince Captain Willoch to surrender his ships and the port city, that the Germans came in peace, and that they were there to protect Norwegian neutrality from British and French aggression. Something which was After conferring with his superior officer, Captain Willoch declined and opted to fight. As Gerlach was on his way back to the Wilhelm Heidkamp, the Eidsvoll fired a red flare, and Captain Willoch shouted, "Man the cannons, we're gonna fight now, boys." The Wilhelm Heidkamp fired a spread of torpedoes at the outdated Norwegian cruiser, igniting the ammunition magazine and blowing the ship in two. The front of the ship sank in seconds, the stern following in mere minutes, the propellers still turning. Of the crew, 175 died in the freezing Arctic waters. Among them, Captain Willock. Only 8 survived. Further in the Ofot Fjord, in the middle of Narvik harbor, was the HNO MS Norge. They heard the explosions in the distance, but nothing was seen until 2 German destroyers came out of the fog and snow. Captain Willock's superior officer, Captain Per Askim, immediately ordered his ship to fire on the advancing Germans. However, poor weather conditions and having essentially obsolete equipment rendered the counterattack nearly symbolic in gesture.
Watch out, guard.
The German destroyer Bernd von Arnim fired several torpedoes at the Norge, and the ship was destroyed and sank within minutes. 101 crew members perished, and 90 were rescued. The commanding officer at Narvik, Colonel Konrad Sundlo, was a member of National Union. He offered the Germans unconditional surrender shortly after the sinking of the Eidsvold and the Norge.
Careful, there's a guard.
Narvik was taken. So was Trondheim, Bergen, Stavanger, Egersund, Kristiansand, Arendal, Horten, and paratroopers had taken both of the largest airports. German soldiers were now flooding into the country.
Look out, guard.
On the evening of April 9th, at 7:30 p.m., Vidkun Quisling marched into the studios at NRK to announce his coup, the first ever radio broadcast coup d'etat in history. A small party of German paratroopers, led by military attaché Hauptmann Eberhard Spiller, gave chase to the royal family and members of the legitimate government. A hasty defense was set up just west of Elverum, and during the night, a mix of brave volunteers backed up with only a few soldiers from the local military camp, Terningmoen, armed only with ancient Krag Jørgensen bolt-action rifles and 2 old Browning machine guns, beat back and held off the German advance. Hauptmann Spiller died during the engagement, and the German forces retreated. The German High Command recognized the Norwegian government's unwillingness to capitulate, and on the following day demanded the King of Norway, His Majesty King Haakon VII, recognize and formally appoint Quisling as the new Prime Minister. The king, bless him, said he would rather abdicate his throne than recognize any government headed by Vidkun Quisling. the Germans responded by sending in the Luftwaffe and bombing the towns of Elverum and Nybergsund. Both the royal family and the fleeing government made it out alive, but there were significant civilian casualties. As of April 11th, Norway and Nazi Germany were officially at war. On May 25th, the gold of the Norwegian National Treasury left Norway aboard the HMS Enterprise, first to Scapa Flow and then on to Greenock, where it was put ashore and onto a train bound for the vaults of the Bank of England in London. On June 7th, King Haakon and Crown Prince Olav, as well as the members of the Norwegian government, boarded the British cruiser HMS Devonshire in Tromsø and departed for London, going into exile. The official fighting in Norway would last for 2 months and a day until June 10th, when the last Norwegian forces officially ceased resistance and demobilized. No other country invaded by Nazi Germany would come close to halting them for that long.
Watch out, guard.
The invasion was over, and the occupation began. For the remainder of the war, around 300,000 Germans were garrisoned in Norway. Hitler had gained vital naval and air bases by which to attack Britain, and most importantly, secured a supply of vital iron ore coming out of Sweden.
He's a guard.
But for the Norwegians, the unofficial fighting had just begun.